Dear colleagues, let me welcome everyone to this virtual gathering of All European Academies Science Education Working Group to discuss current challenges for international large-scale studies of achievement. This is an invitation-only meeting, but the demand for the information was much wider than we expected. Therefore, with the permission of participants, the meeting will be recorded, edited, and published. The outcomes of the meeting will undergo further revision to form the statement of Science Education Working Group on the issue. And we hope to have face-to-face meeting in Kiev, Ukraine, where the National Academy of Educational Sciences of Ukraine would host the event as soon as the situation allows. Since Science Education Working Group deals with the global influences on science education, the need for internationally comparable data is inevitable, especially when we talk about assessment. As we know, the Program for International Students Assessment has been providing evidence-based feedback to the country's participants, constantly improving and widening its evaluation instruments for the past 20 years. But at some point, the feedback on feedback becomes essential. That is where the Working Group on Science Education, having international experts in the field among its members, decided to invite broader range of international experts in educational psychology, educational theory, philosophy of education, educational policy, evaluation, and educational measurement to address the issue of success, as well as current challenges for international large-scale studies of achievement. Our working group on science education is lucky to have among its members, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to the first expert, Professor Ben Aksapo, who is a professor of education at University of Szeged, Hungary. I hope Professor Ben Aksapo, as well as other experts, will forgive me if I do not announce all their merits because of the time constraints, since the list is really endless. I just would like to mention that Ben Aksapo used to be a member of problem-solving expert groups that devised the assessment frameworks for the 2003 and 2012 OECD PISA surveys. He was also a member of PISA Governing Board 2005-2013 and Vice Chair of the Board 2008-2014. The title of Professor Ben Aksapo's presentation is The Impact of PISA on the Development of Educational Research and Evidence-Based Decision-Making. So please, Professor Ben Aksapo, the floor is yours.
Okay, so what I started to talk about is the outline of my presentation. And I'm going to speak a little bit about the innovation of PISA and their impact. And finally, I discuss the internal and external challenges of the PISA process. So we may distinguish three different levels of feedback in education. And the first one is the system level feedback. Beyond that, we have two other important feedback systems, feedback loops, the institute level and student level. In my opinion, student level feedback that is frequent, precise, immediate is the most important, and my own research is connected to that one, classroom, formative, diagnostic, and other similar types of assessments. But today we are going to talk about the system level assessment, and my question here is how the system level assessment and the research related to that can be transferred to the other two levels of assessment in the education systems. As the participants are familiar with the aims and characteristics of PISA, maybe I skip this slide. I thought that there would be more participants today who are not so well informed about the PISA. At this point, I just would like to highlight that originally the PISA process, the PISA assessment system, was designed to give feedback for the most developed countries, namely the OECD countries, and later it was extended to a number of other countries as well. So you know the characteristics, what I'm going to skip. What I would like to mention here is that using evidence for improving education system is not so trivial. It's a relatively new initiative to use research results to improve education systems. And we see a number of books and other publications that discuss how bad decisions took place during the past decades and how billions and billions of dollars were spent for several kinds of so-called reforms that did not result in any improvement in education. So using evidences and research results, that's a relatively new issue. And from my point of view, PISA and the entire PISA is important in helping the implementing the evidence-based decision making. In the past decades, in a number of countries, this idea had more and more attention. Therefore, several countries, including Finland, Great Britain, and Germany in Europe, initiated research programs for developing the capacity of educational research. So the impact of PISA can be considered in this context. I just would like to highlight that PISA has produced a large number of books and publications in the past decades. So these few books, what you see in this picture, is from my bookshelf. I took this picture some years ago when I still collected printed materials. And that was about the time when OECD also published another volume about the evidence in education, highlighting the importance of evidence-based decision-making. I also would add that in some European countries, it's becoming the main tendency, using evidence in education. For example, when the presidency of the European Union was in Germany, so Germany was responsible for the issues in Europe. That was the main topic related to education, introducing, promoting evidence-based education in Europe. Even though it is not new, but in some countries it's quite difficult to implement these ideas. This slide just indicates that the results, the initial results of PISA, the PISA 2018, were published in 3 volumes. So it was always over 1,000 pages, what in the initial PISA report we can see. And it's important to highlight that many of the non-experts, media people and lay people who dispute the results of PISA maybe see and read only a few pages of the results and not the entire report or these bulky volumes. At the next slide, I am just listing a few innovations of PISA, and later on I show their impact. What I see very important is the framework development and the new conception of knowledge, what was introduced by PISA, this literacy conception. It introduced a new sampling method. It also used an extended system of background questionnaires. So we have a lot of background data, and we can analyze the context of learning. There are sophisticated data analysis. The other innovation is the innovative domains. So beyond the 3 main domains, reading, mathematics, and science, in every cycle, there is a 4th domain called innovative domain. That's very important. Also, PISA promoted technology-based assessment, and in a large number of countries, it has a great impact, shifting the assessment systems from paper-based to computerized systems. PISA has been focusing on excellence, equity, and equality at the same time, and PISA also developed new indicators that make these dimensions, these characteristics of education visible. So on about the impact, I would again say that PISA highlighted a new conception of knowledge, new dimension of knowledge, that's application. Also, it emphasized the importance of the assessment of higher order thinking skills on the innovative domains, and it had an impact on teams and on our diagnostic assessment system, as many other national and international assessment movements. So here is the list of the innovative domains. It started in 2000 with learning strategies. That is especially important from Hungarian point of view. We have been using the same questionnaire for assessing the learning strategies of our students, and we try to improve. We use the concept of learning to learn, so we introduce new courses to help our students to improve their learning strategies. The problem solving, assessment of problem solving started in 2000. That was a paper-based complex problem solving assessment. In 2006, the computer-based assessment of science was the innovation, then digital reading, and in 2012, dynamic problem solving. That was probably one of the most sophisticated international assessment ever. It's been very interesting, and it was continued by collaborative problem solving and global competencies in 2018. I would like to mention that this is probably the turning point when the use of this innovative domain went too far. So in the dynamic problem solving, we just have enough scientific foundation to run such an assessment, but the collaborative problem solving was not so well supported by scientific evidences, and the global competencies was a conception that was not so well supported with scientific evidences. So the assessment community questioned the usefulness of this global competencies assessment. I show just one example how these new types of analysis impacted some of the countries. For example, in Hungary learned that the impact of socioeconomic status of the students is the highest one in Hungary, and that initiated new waves of research, and probably these research results will have an impact on the policy and practice of education as well. The conception of educational resilience is also a very important issue. I show here the definition of the academically resilient students. So those students who belong to the lower quarter according to their economic status, and those students, the proportion of those students whose achievement is in the highest quarter can be considered as resilient students. We also use the conception of educational resilience in our research. One of my PhD students has been dealing with that, and we also try to adapt the conception to local level, for example, city level and regional level, to indicate how important this is. Then finally, I turn to the discussion part of my talk. I mentioned two different types of problems with the PISA. One type, a set of problems related to the external problem of PISA. In my opinion, it's a problem that the number of researchers or the impact of researchers is decreasing. Fewer and fewer researchers and experts are represented in several PISA boards, for example, in the governing board. Another problem is the growing role of private for-profit companies. So these companies try to serve their own purposes, and this deviate PISA from its original aim and mission. And also the expansion of PISA is also problematic, as a large number of new and less developed countries join to the PISA assessments, and it's not easy to handle this diversity of countries in the assessment. There are some external problems as well in the interpretation and acceptance of PISA. As for the impact of PISA on educational policy, varies from country to country. In some countries, they use the results according to its original purpose, but in some other countries, they misuse it or just neglect the result. Media has a negative impact quite often by simplification and misinterpretation of the results. And within the academic community, I see two types of problems. One is that many experts are silent, so they are not going to discuss broadly or openly the PISA results and their problems. They don't fight with the misconceptions or conspiracy theories related to the PISA assessment, so they are silent. On the other hand, there are noisy non-experts who propagate their views broadly and sometimes damage the credibility of PISA. So finally, to initiate further dispute, I put the impact of PISA or educational research in an even broader context. I mentioned two issues and they can be considered as the impact of these issues or the impact of intervention can be observed on different time scales. And this is the COVID-19 pandemic. The human intervention, the impact of the intervention can be observed in weeks, within weeks. Education and educational intervention has a longer time. It needs a longer time to be the impact observable for maybe years. And climate change needs decades so that the human intervention will be made observable. And also, I can mention some examples for denying the importance of science in these issues. So the anti-vaccination movement maybe costs human lives. As for education, we together may collect some examples for that. And we also deal with climate change. We probably agree that climate change denial is also very dangerous for the entire mankind. So as for the PISA, well, it also generates a lot of dispute and contradiction, but my opinion is that it may have an important impact on education research, and through improving the condition of education research, we may help improving education systems in general. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Benek-Sapa, for your insight. And I remind the participants that we will have enough time for questions, comments, and discussion after the presentations of experts. So we move on to our next expert, who is Dr. Piotr Zamoyski, Assistant Professor at University of Gdańsk, Poland, and visiting professor at University of Arts and Sciences in Cologne, Germany. His main field of research is educational theory and philosophy of education. Poland was in the center of PISA attention in 2018, and Dr. Piotr Zamoyski kindly agreed to reflect on the outcome of the assessments. His topic of presentation is circulation of mediated artifacts, questioning the consequences of PISA for education, the example of Poland. Please, Dr. Piotr Zamoyski, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So let me start with some facts about the example I want to focus on, which is Poland in regard to PISA. So last assessment was pretty good news. So as you can see, Poland is quite high, significantly above the average in all key scores. But was this always the case? Not at all. So if you can see that at the beginning, we were in a completely different place, and so below the average, and really not in the same position. So what happened? And of course, there are lots of answers and provisionally answers to these questions, but one of the most frequently discussed in Polish educational sciences was the fact that after the program of international student assessment was established in 1997, just a year later, in 1998, the Polish government announced the reform of educational system in Poland that would take place starting from the next year, 1999. Here is what happened. So till 1999, we had a system consisting of 8 years of primary school education, and then there was a choice that the pupil could make: either go to high school that then led to higher education institutions, or to choose a vocational 3 years school. But that was a system where there were no nationwide exams except for the one at the end of the high school that would enable people to start studying at a higher education institution. And there were just internal exams that every single high school have devised for themselves to select the participant, to select the potential students that applied to get into the particular high school. Then the new reform that was envisaged just after the call for PISA was announced were changing that structure. So we have 6 years of primary education, then we have lower middle, which we call gymnasium in Poland, and then we have the higher middle. And that was also the moment after gymnasium where people could choose between the vocational education or the typical high school that would then lead to the higher education. So this was structured along with the 3 external test exams that were designed nationwide, and so in a very PISA-like mode. First after the 6 years of primary education, then after the 3 years of the lower middle school. What is very important is this. This is exactly the moment where pupils are 15. So as you can see, the whole system was designed, so especially this particular block was designed to prepare students to pass a particular test exam when they are 15. So in the case of Poland, it was even before the first survey that PISA has severely influenced the system. It was about to diagnose. Hence, for me, it is obvious that the central challenge regarding international large-scale assessments in education is the tension between the facts they want to disclose and the artifacts that they produce. From the very beginning, this tension is quite visible in PISA documents. These are the quotes from the first, I think, a document that announces the whole program. So there are facts that need to be disclosed, but these facts then should become political tools or tools for making policies, to develop policies, and so on and so forth. Hence, we deal with the doubleness of PISA, which is both diagnostic investigations into a particular social reality and a political agent in itself. And this is, I think, this is possible because what is examined, that is because the facts which are established concern a living, intelligent organism with a particular history. This organism will adapt, that is, it will invent particular, peculiar, unique strategies to adapt. So it is not only that PISA influences particular educational policies regarding educational systems, but also that these policies then indirectly enforce particular strategies of schools, teachers, and students. So more or less, I would say that these policies and these strategies do not emerge from some direct application of the program final recommendations. And I fully agree with the speaker that just finished his presentation, that most of also policymakers don't read the whole reports. That is for sure. They are filtered. Now, these recommendations are filtered by the cultural context of a particular social terrain. So these unique strategies are not taken into account in the subsequent assessments in measuring the culturally mediated artifacts of the previous assessment. So we have, what we have, I think, is a circulation, but later yesterday, and before I could even change anything in this presentation, I thought that maybe also this whole diagram is misleading, because I think that what it takes out of the picture is the very construction of the tool of the survey itself that is used to measure, which is also highly influential in developing the strategies, both for developing the measurements that are devised internally in educational system, that is the high stakes exams that are more and more designed to look alike PISA assessments, and through that it also influences. So the very tool it is used for measurement also influences the teachers, schools, and student strategies. Yes, I'm finishing. So for me, there are many questions one can ask in relation to this. Like the one concerning self-awareness of this circulation or the status of knowledge produced by in this way. But for me, the most important and the most pressing is that of responsibility. So I think that in relation to the circulation, we can think of a threefold responsibility: political, for diverse policies and evoked by PISA that are imposed on teachers and students; ethical, for wanted and not foreseen effects of this circulation. But for me, the most important is an educational responsibility that refers to diverse renderings of PISA as a political project. So what happens on a local level, how PISA acts there, not what it recommends, but what it does, what kind of educational strategies it causes as an event in itself. What happens when its influence is filtered by the cultural context of this place? And only if you ask these questions, then only if one takes into account the indirect agency of PISA, one can actually start to get into terms with how can students perform lately so well when they are taught by the least engaged and least supportive teachers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Piotr Zamoyski, for your solid reflection. And our next expert is Dr. David Rutkowski, Associate Professor with the joint appointment in Educational Policy and Educational Inquiry at Indiana University, USA. Prior to Indiana University, David was a professor of education at the Center of Educational Management at the University of Oslo, Norway. Professor David Rutkowski's research is focused in the area of educational policy, evaluation, and educational management, with the specific emphasis on international large-scale assessment. Professor David Rutkowski shares his presentation with Dr. Leslie Rutkowski, Associate Professor of Inquiry Methodology, Counseling, and Educational Psychology at Indiana University, United States of America. Leslie is also a professor of educational measurement at University of Oslo, Norway. Their topic of presentation is use and misuse of international large-scale assessments, why it matters to science education and policy. So please, Dr. David Rutkowski, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. I think there'll probably be a little bit of overlap on what we're talking about, especially with Bueno's very nice and comprehensive presentation, and also Peter. I think both of the presentations, you'll see some overlap. What I'm going to talk about a little bit is this idea of validity. And the reason I like to frame this in a validity conversation is, first of all, my understanding is most of you are science educators. Validity is still a big deal in science, right? We care about this idea of validity. But we're going to talk a little broadly about how we see validity in measurement. And then I'm going to talk about a few general issues where I see issues around PISA and things, especially for science educators or people concerned with science education to really consider. And then Leslie's going to provide some, I guess, some more detailed issues that we have found when examining PISA data. So that's what we're going to do. So validity, I always say it's the bane of my existence. For a couple years, I said that I was going to read 2 to 3 validity articles a week concerning validity and measurement. And while I read those articles, I only became more confused. Because validity, although it seems like a very easy concept, it becomes such a difficult concept, especially when we think about measurement and then when we think about internationally measuring things. But when we talk about assessment, validity is really the key to our measurement process, right? And so if we think about, we can think about validity in many different ways, but here I'm going to think about validity as the degree to which an evidence-based argument supports the accuracy of the test interpretations for a proposed use of the test results, right? So it's this interpretation and use of the test results. So what can we use PISA for? And what can we not use PISA for, right? What interpretations are valid and what interpretations are not valid? PISA as a test is neither valid or invalid test, right? It's the interpretations we make of PISA. And I think that's something important for all of us to think about. So we validate interpretations and uses of the test, but we never validate the test. Validity depends on the quality of an evidence-based argument. The argument is intended to support the accuracy of the test interpretations, and the argument deals with the extent to which those interpretations support the test proposed use. Right? So this is the idea of validity that we're going to move forward when we think about PISA for this conversation. So we have an evidence-based argument. And the one thing I like to think about when I think, especially in measurement, when I think about an evidence-based argument and the type of evidence that we need, it's like a court case. So we're providing evidence to support the claim that we want to make. And so if we think about, if we have a court case and it's a murder case, right? We need lots of evidence, right? And so those cases go on forever. There's lots of evidence that are needed. But say like if you go to court for running a stop sign, you know, the evidence is going to be pretty short. So the claim that we need to make in policy and what you want to use PISA for, that's also going to matter what kind of evidence we need to make that case. So if we want to change national policy based on PISA, we should be sure, because that's a really high stakes decision, that the evidence PISA is providing us is the evidence we need to make that decision. Now, if we wanted to inform some ideas around our research, you know, the evidence would have to be a little bit less, right? So if we're thinking about that. Before I go into that, I just wanted to put up this slide just for those of you that aren't familiar with the test making process. Now, this isn't particular to PISA, but this is in general what happens. We write the frameworks, we have item specifications, we do item development, we have translation, we pilot and review, we field trial after the pilot and review, then we make more revisions, we have the main survey, data review, scoring, standard setting, score reporting. And the reason I just want you to see that is because I think there's often this misconception that we just write a test and go out and give it to students, but we don't do that, right? And so it's really a thoughtful process. And that's one of the things that when I go talk about PISA a little more, it is a very thoughtful process, and we have to keep that in mind. Most of you are well familiar in this group, I think, well familiar with the ILSAs. We have the three big ones, PISA, TIMSS, and PEARLS. But for our validity conversation, I just want to just pull out a few things. First of all, PISA's every 3 years, TIMSS every 4 years, PEARLS every 5 years. But who's tested in PISA? It's 15-year-old students, 15-year-olds enrolled in school. Now that's going to be different from TIMSS because TIMSS is going to be a grade-based sample, right? And so that's going to matter quite a bit when we talk about validity of actually who the sample is. What is tested, we know is already been discussed, is what is tested in PISA. One of the things I do agree, which has been said before, is that the global competency and some of the other ideas that we're starting as PISA expands the test are quite messy. In that, then I think really brings into call that the PISA consortium was willing to put out things that were less than optimal, right? So we know the global competency did not measure global competency, but yet they still put out reports saying that they measured global competency. And I think that's well documented. And that might also have some of the critique of not having kind of more academics understanding this process, doing this, and having more policymakers saying, well, we measured it, it's good enough, let's do this. We know the sponsoring organizations, and here we see the countries that took the test. So I think all these ILSAs have some good, and we have to remember that they're good. Develop strong frameworks. I think the frameworks are pretty strong, minus, and I point out global competency because I've just done some research on that, minus some of the special areas. But as you as science educators, you can look at the frameworks, tell me how good they are. But I've heard, talking with Spine, that the framework was pretty good. They generally have representative samples and go through a lot of adjudication. Compared to many national assessments, the quality control is, I think, superb. And the process is fairly transparent. So you get to look at the process, and I think that's pretty exciting. One thing that we talked about already is PISA is administered by the OECD. This means that the results have only been validated for OECD countries, right? It's, as was suggested before, we have the voting board, the people that can actually vote on the assessment. We have the expert here, but it is OECD countries plus Brazil, right? Brazil has been a long-time member of the PISA consortium. But we have this validity concern. If you're a non-voting member, if you're a non-OECD country, you really need to work at validating the interpretations you want to make from the test, right? And that's going to be a really big issue if you're a non-OECD country. I wanted to talk quickly about OECD expansion with PISA, and that's going to matter because as it expands, it's less focused. As it's less focused, then we really need to be concerned about if it's doing what it needs to be doing. If we look at in 2000, we had 34 OECD countries and 13 non-OECD countries. In 2018, 37 OECD countries, 43 non-OECD countries, right? So we now see this kind of this expansion of the test, but now it's even extended beyond non-OECD countries. And we also see a huge drop in the average GDP per capita, right? And so we're seeing this huge heterogeneity. So I'm going to just a few more slides. PISA is a test of 15-year-old students enrolled in school, right? So we need to remember that. And in many countries, the sample expands grades. In the United States, for example, we have 15-year-olds. We actually have 15-year-olds in 7 grades. PISA doesn't test all of those 15-year-olds. I believe it's 5, but it might be 4. But we are testing many different grades. So given that PISA has not been validated to measure curriculum and students can be in different grades, it is not appropriate to use PISA to talk about schools or students, right? I mean, we can't talk about these students in schools because we're not aligned there. And that goes to my second point here. PISA measures 15-year-old students on topics that the OECD has deemed important and is not connected to their curriculum in every country. That's really, really a task. So that means that your schools can be doing really good teaching. It's just teaching different things than what the OECD decided that was important. Now that's something that we all need to keep in mind because it goes into the validity argument. We shouldn't be talking about schools, right? When we talk about PISA, right? So given that PISA has not been validated to measure curriculum, it's not appropriate to use PISA to talk about our schools, other than saying that schools may not be teaching what the OECD is measuring, right? Unless we go back and do the study to make sure that it's aligned with curriculum. And then we also do the study to make sure that this lowest student at 15-year-old, no matter what grade they were in, saw that curriculum. We really have a misalignment, right? So we provide enough evidence that that interpretation becomes problematic. And so that's my slides here, and I think I did it in around 10 minutes. And now I'm going to pass off to Leslie, which is going to continue this conversation. I'll stop sharing.
Okay, can everyone see the presentation? Great, all right. So thanks, David. And I'm just gonna pick up on a, really related to a lot of things that others were saying and to sort of follow up with David's presentation. I'm gonna pick up on a few more technical issues that have arisen during the course of our research over the last few years, looking at some issues in international assessments in general, PISA in particular. We've talked a lot about the growth in international assessment, so I won't belabor the point, but I just want to note the first cycle, which was the IEA 12 study pilot, it had 12 countries in 1960. In 2022, PISA is expected to have 85 educational systems participating. Newcomers will include El Salvador, Guatemala, Jamaica, and Mongolia. One thing that I want to highlight here is that the economic development in these countries are very, very different from OECD countries. The GDP per capita is about 10% of OECD country averages. So each of these countries have an annual GDP per capita of about $4,500 versus the average OECD country, which is about $47,000. So really stark differences just from that perspective. We also see, this is from 2015 science achievement, and each one of these curves represents the achievement distribution for each one of the participating countries. And we picked an arbitrary demarcation point that if a country had scored below or above a quarter of a standard deviation beyond the OECD average, we sort of marked those out in a darker color. And what you'll notice here is that we've got this group of countries that are really quite a bit different. On this lower left-hand side, these low performers. The very lowest in this case is the Dominican Republic, which really stands out as being a low-performing country in PISA. And it's difficult when you're proposing to measure more than 80 educational systems. Benno commented on this, that as PISA expands, it's harder and harder to make one test work for all of these countries. We have different languages, cultures, geographies, economic development. There's more or less one test. In 2022, there will be the standard option, which will be a multi-stage test that's, of course, computerized. There will also be the paper and pencil option, which I know the Ukraine has participated in. And then there's the PISA-D option. So these countries that participated in PISA for development will be coming into the main PISA, and they will continue to take the PISA-D part of that test. They will be put onto the same reporting scale as PISA so that their results can be compared. So here's what I want to sort of focus on is on measurement quality. In some countries, the test works really well. Now, what I want to highlight here are the bottom two panels. So the panel where we have small bars, and that looks like a bell curve. This is the achievement distribution for each one of these countries. So on the left-hand side, we have Poland. On the right-hand side, we have Czech Republic. Poland had a mean of 501.44. the Czech Republic had a mean of 492.83. This was on, this was overall. We used the first plausible value for this analysis just to keep things straightforward. The dots that are sitting underneath that distribution represent the items that were administered on the PISA test. So if the test is doing a good job, and this is the difficulty that is on the same scale as achievement. So if a test is doing a good job, we would expect that most of that achievement distribution would be sitting on top of that distribution of item difficulties. And in both Poland and the Czech Republic, that's true. The center of the achievement distribution rests on top of approximately the center of the item distribution. So students are measured, all students are measured reasonably well in both Poland and the Czech Republic. We see some differences though when we look at some of the other ALLEA members. I picked out Moldova and Montenegro as being two sort of standouts here. In Moldova, you see that the mean is 428. So that means that their distribution is shifted left along that continuum. And as a result, you see less support from the items that are given to them. So the center of their distribution is sort of standing off on its own with few items resting underneath of it, meaning that their typical student isn't measured by very many items. And at the end of the distribution on the far left-hand side of this, the lower, say, third or quarter of their distribution is measured by no items at all. There are no items that match the proficiency level of their students. The same in Montenegro, you'll see that you have just one or two items that are measuring about the lower third of the distribution in Montenegro, so not very well represented by this test. PISA 2015 science. Then I just wanted to highlight maybe the worst case in 2015. They're not an ALLEA member, but it's an extreme example. This is the Dominican Republic with a mean of 331. And you can see that nearly all of their distribution has no items that are matched to it. So the lower half to 2/3 of the Dominican Republic is measured by almost nothing. So the certainty of what we know about these students is very low. We just know they don't know what's on PISA. We don't know what they actually know. And this suggests that this version of PISA is a really poor test of what Dominican Republic students know and can do in science. So what are the consequences of this? I just wanted to put this into a probability metric, which I think is reasonably easy to understand. So if we just take an average PISA item, which has a difficulty of around 500 on the PISA scale, and then we take a typical student from each one of the countries, and by typical, I mean a student that's sitting in the center of their distribution, and I calculate the probability of a correct response in a few countries that we selected, you can see that a Dominican Republic student has about a 6% chance of getting a correct answer on a typical PISA item, all the way up to in Finland that has a typical student, a typical Finnish student has a really high probability of a correct answer. They have a 72% chance of getting an average PISA item correct. So again, from another perspective, you can see that the adequacy of PISA for measuring students, especially low-performing students in low-performing countries, it's not doing a very good job of measuring. But the future's here. PISA 2018, as I said before, was administered as a multi-stage test. And it looks about like this, where you start off with a group of items that determines where you go next. If you get most of them right, you go to a group of more difficult items. If you get most of those right, you go to even more difficult items. If you get them wrong, then you're routed to easier items. This has a really clear advantage in that students have a better test experience because the items are better matched to their proficiency levels. We can also get more precise population estimates of proficiency with fewer test questions. And if we go through the trouble of actually designing these test questions to fit in a multi-stage test design, we'll do a better job of catching students at the ends of the continuum. So another way of representing this visually is that we can just cover a lot more of the continuum with better precision in an MST design. But there are some challenges. Item development really isn't going on in PISA that's specific for an MST. They're using existing items and doing their best to assign those to modules in an MST that can be considered medium, easy, and difficult. And then we're always balancing, like, trend items have to stay the way they are, otherwise we compromise the ability to measure trend. And then countries that would most benefit from very tailored items, like the Dominican Republic, like El Salvador, like Guatemala, technology is a challenge in these countries. So administering via a multi-stage test is a challenge. And we also need a whole lot of easy items to be able to do a good job with this, which is expensive. Item development is an expensive proposition. Oh, and then finally, I just want to thank the Norwegian Research Council for funding a lot of this research over the past few years. So a nod to them. And that's all.
We don't hear you.
Okay, thank you very much, David and Leslie, for guiding us through the appropriate use of data. Before we dive into active roundtable discussion, let me introduce you to ALLEA Science Education Working Group member, Professor Svein Sjoberg. He's a professor in science education at Oslo University in Norway. His field of proficiency is nuclear physics and educational psychology. He became the first professor in the field of science education in the Nordic countries. Professor Svein Sjoberg's current research interests are the social, ethical, and cultural aspects of science education and education in general, and in particular, the impacts and the influence of large-scale assessment studies like PISA and TIMSS. So the title of Professor Sjoberg's presentation is Education as a Global Race, or for Democracy and Solidarity, the Side Effects of PISA Testing. Professor Sjoberg, the floor is yours.
Can you see the screen now? Okay. My presentation will largely be about the side effects or the political aspects of science for science education by the current testing regime, the side effects. And this front page gives you an idea about what it is about. Let me see. We have today, I mean, education has always been influenced and inspired by what happens in other countries. But for the last, say, 10, 20 years, the global influence on educational policy has increased dramatically all over the world. And to simplify very much, on the one hand, you see the UN, the UNESCO philosophy about human rights, global solidarity, peace, sustainable development, climate change, poverty, eradication, and equity, as exemplified here by the current Sustainable Development Goals, where education is number 4, but where all the other aspects also relate to actually science education. Sustainable Development Goals as a priority. On the other hand, and I'm simplifying very much, of course, you see the organizations like the OECD and indeed the World Bank with other agendas, other priorities, globalization, free trade, economic growth, and competitiveness, and often leading to neoliberal policies, privatization, commercialization, and standardization of education. So this is, in my opinion, a kind of global perspective on this. And the instrument for the OECD is very much a PISA test, and the PISA-like instrument, like PISA for development, PISA for schools, PISA for adults, the PIAC, and even PISA for children, more or less. The differences are quite remarkable between the background and philosophies of the two organizations. Let me just remind you that UNESCO, of course, is the whole world with 193 member states, and recently US and Israel left some years ago. And UNESCO's mission is guided very much by the moral and the normative principles like education as a human right. And of course, as you all know, the E in UNESCO is education, and the S is for science, and C for culture. On the other hand, you have the OECD organization, which has 35 highly industrialized member states, and its aim to support economic growth and strengthen the global free market. The priority is E for economy and not for education. But education receives, of course, lately, the last decades actually, more and more attention from the OECD because its role to promote economic growth according to human capital theory. And PISA actually claims to measure future prosperity, a claim which is strongly rejected by many scholars and from many fields. But that's a key way of understanding the influence of the OECD, because it is claimed that it is a predictor of economic growth. PISA is rather different from, for instance, TIMSS, and David noted a few of the differences. It's not testing school science, it's not testing according to the curriculum, but it's testing what the OECD deems to be important, regardless of what is important in the curricula in the different countries. And it claims to measure no less than the quality and efficiency of the nation's education system. And as you know, PISA is financed, it's owned, and it's directed by governments in the OECD countries and governed politically by representatives from these governments. And from the very beginning, and you can find several quotes on this, PISA is intentionally political and it's intentionally normative, while TIMSS and indeed PIRLS and other studies is more descriptive, analytical, and more careful in drawing sort of conclusions about what countries should do, normative. And PISA scores have become a kind of global gold standard. And this is not only a critique from the outside, this is also how it is presented by the OECD itself. Like in this talk, a very well visited PISA talk or TED talk by the PISA leader, Andreas Schleicher. And I looked up a few days ago, and you see it has quite a high number of views here. And it's transcribed in many different languages, and these are the very first words where Andreas Schleicher describes what the PISA is really all about. He says that PISA is really a story on how international comparisons have globalized the field of education that we usually treat as an affair of domestic policy. That's a very clear statement that it's about globalization of the field of education and lifting it out of the national sphere. And when it presents the membership or the participation, it's presented as 90% of the world's economy. And that, for educators, this is a strange way of counting children, if that should be the point. It's about economy. As has been said, they are not testing science curricula or according to curricula in any of the participating countries. Its testing is based on an assessment and analytical framework, like you see the 2008 assessment framework here. Very many good sides for that, but it's quite interesting to see what is not mentioned, and you can look through it and search for words. Human rights are not mentioned anywhere in this 200-page dense document. Sustainable development goals are not mentioned. Education for sustainable development are not mentioned in this overall, and this is for the 3 domains of the PISA testing. Now there are the definition of science literacy in the PISA 2015 version, which was when science was the main topic. I like this. It contains a lot of aspects like we as science educators find also to be recommended. I mentioned a few. Inquiry-based science education, which has the ILSA, which is a key concern for also for this working group, is elaborated in this framework. Likewise, there is a stress on argumentation and critical thinking in science, which is also a key concern for science educators. Also addressing social scientific issues, which is, as you know, a prime concern in many countries in science education. And also of addressing the interest in science and science and technology careers. Nature of science is another key word. And all these are treated quite well, I think, in the assessment framework. Now, some of these questions or some of these constructs are addressed in the student questionnaires, but they are not embedded in the actual tests. So none of these aspects are embedded when we look at the PISA score. They are not testing according to this definition they have of science literacy. They are testing simply correct answers on the questions that are in a test. One of the reasons is, of course, that they don't correlate well. So you can't simply add them to the test and make one construct because they don't correlate to make up a coherent test. So that's important for us to think about. And in many ways, they are changing the very meaning of schooling, lifting debates about schools and education out of the sphere of values, politics, culture, and debates in the countries. And in many ways also changing the way we talk about schooling, the concepts we use, the way we approach education. Words like productivity, efficiency, value for money, competitiveness to have success are key words if you look at the PISA reports, for instance. And success, successful children, successful schools, successful education system is defined more or less as high PISA scores, or at least increasing PISA scores at the minimal cost. Efficiency is PISA points per dollar. So the child is implicitly treated as human capital to be refined at school for the lowest possible cost, with one common global metric for quality, the PISA score. And of course, now we have also got the PISA for development and other scores. And it has, as we all know, it has been met with critique from scholars and from very many fields, from statistics and methods, and from, of course, from social sciences and politics. The UN Sustainable Development Goals were set in 2015 by the United Nations Assembly and is intended to be achieved in 2030. And some documents are made to mark the path this way. And as we see here, the quality education, quality and for equity is number 4, SDG 4. But the other aspects like health, clean water, clean energy, peace and justice, protecting the planet, climate change, for instance, all these are important aspects also for science education. And 2 years later, there was a conference in Korea, actually, in Incheon, where the people working in for the SDG 4, they produced a declaration and a framework for action for the implementation of SDG 4. This is the declaration, and this is what it is about. And it's worth reading the text in this unanimous declaration. And it says, We further note the challenges of ensuring education as a right and a public good, especially in the context of increased privatization and commercialization of education. We are concerned that the growth of profit-making in education and the proliferation of low-fee private school chains, supported by some international financing institutions and donor agencies, undermine free public quality education and exacerbate inequalities based on wealth, gender, disability, migration, status, ethnicity, and location. So this is really a concern for, for those trying to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. My conclusion or kind of summary is that we as educators, as science educators, we need to understand something of the greater global picture and the tensions. On the one hand, you have globalization, standardization, test-driven neoliberal policies, privatization, commercialization, market-driven reforms, often with private providers. And on the other hand, we have international solidarity and empathy, and education as a concern for the global challenges listed here, education as a human right and as a public function, and also education as a common good. And actually the OECD PISA project and how it is used also by the organizers is a drive in, I would say, in the other direction. So that's my input. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Stjorberg, for expressing your concern on such hot issues. Now I think we should start with clarification questions to the presenters before we move to the comments and discussion. If the participants have questions, please introduce yourself and your affiliation before asking the question. In Ukraine, we say if there are no questions, that then it is either everything is clear or nothing is clear.
I can ask a question.
Okay, go ahead. Introduce yourself and your.
Yeah, so I'm Lena Kjellén from Sweden. So I wanted to ask Svein if you would make, do you think it would be possible to make a test that would take into account now the other side, like the UNESCO side of education? Could you make one, or you must have many, or what would a good test system look like in your dreams?
I'm on now, yes. I think this is a big debate, and I think the recommendations that I ended with, they have made targets for the SDG 4, measurable targets. So they've been quite clever in making a lot of targets that can put number on it. But now there is also a tension between the OECD and UNESCO, because the OECD has great statistical powers. They have manpower, they have the skills, very well organized organization. And there is a conflict between UNESCO and the OECD concerning this, because the OECD is coming in, replacing more or less UNESCO as provider of all this data. I've lately seen several articles which I wanted to show to you here, but I didn't get the time, addressing this about the conflict between UNESCO and the OECD, and indeed the worldview between the UNESCO people and the OECD people, one being frustrated by the other because they have so different views on what is a good education and how to put numbers on it. But there is a fair, so the statement I read is, I think, is coming out of the fair, that the OECD is gradually getting not only the 35 rich countries as their market, but they are expanding their market for also for their ideas. I think that is a concern. But maybe David, who is an expert on the policy issues, can say something about this. I don't know.
Well, whenever anyone brings up UNESCO, I always like to at least make a couple comments. I don't know if I share Svein's optimism about UNESCO. Their quality has historically been unbelievably poor. And that might be due to funding and also due to the inability for an organization with that many members and that many votes to actually do anything, especially when it comes to assessment. And so they've always been hamstrung, and they've never really put out a very good assessment, or a high quality assessment. And I think one of the things that I'm even more worried about UNESCO than the OECD at this point is, as they're moving to measure the sustainable development goals, they've kind of thrown out all assessment ideas and everything we know about assessment, and are doing things like policy linking and trying to put, and when we talk about validity, trying to put all these countries' national assessments on the same scale, stuff we know that we shouldn't be doing, and they're just moving that forward to push kind of political agendas. So technically, I think UNESCO has a lot of issues that are problematic, but there's probably other people in the room that might disagree or have a different take on this.
I would agree to that, actually, because I worked as educational advisor in Norway for the UNESCO Commission, and I was struck by the things that you mentioned, the inefficiency, the kind of chaos, and also, but they used to have this International Bureau of Education that was responsible for statistics, but that has been overtaken more or less by the OECD. So I think they live in a kind of symbiosis. They don't like each other, but they are dependent on each other. And the OECD actually needs the credibility of the UN system in order to widen their market for their ideas. And UNESCO needs the OECD to provide good numbers. But what you measure is what you get. So if they are the ones who are defining the indicators, we run the risk, of course, of when you have an indicator, you always go to just increase the indicator, and it can lead the wrong way.
I agree.
Okay, maybe a question of a presenter to a presenter, expert to an expert.
Could I have a question?
Please.
To Sven also. I can see that many education systems are moving in implementing sustainable development education in various ways. And they have, contrary to PISA, which at least up to now, as you have stressed, is ignoring this. Now, there is so many possible understanding of sustainable development. I can even see that in the curricula which are prepared in France, that it's a very critical point in the future for the way the education systems will treat the inclusion in curricula of sustainable development. I would like to have your comment on this trend and of the possible actions.
I guess this question can be addressed to anyone, I think, in present here. But I think you basically, I would agree that in many curricula that I know about, all these things are, they pay lip service to that in some statements, but when it comes to evaluations, exams, and so on, this is forgotten more or less. because it's so difficult to measure.
Yeah.
Just perhaps a comment there on that. Even looking some of the issues and the methodologies and pedagogies underpinning education for sustainability, they are things that PISA has addressed in the student questionnaire, like inquiry, critical thinking, nature of science, and that. And I think it is very hard to assess these, but I think it's not impossible. So perhaps this is something, I don't know, I'm not going to suggest, it's not my expertise, but I think it would be interesting to see these more than part of a questionnaire rather than more part of the test, you know, in addition to the questionnaire. And does TIMS, now I'm probably wrong on this, does TIMS actually look at some things on nature of science in their items, or is that my imagination? Does it attempt to look at critical thinking application of these critical thinking skills and inquiry-based pedagogies in TIMS? Would that be one of the items that's tested? No, no.
I have a question for the group, if that's okay. We have all these science experts here, so I would be interested to have your take on this. One of the things that we know is that, you know, math and reading are a lot easier to assess than science, right? And as we get further up in grades, national systems need focus, right? I mean, necessarily each country or region of the world will have different things in science that are more important to them than others, I would imagine, as curriculum. Do you think that that's true? Or do you think that there's enough at the 8th grade or at the 15-year-old level that there's enough room for comparison? Or do we get so much that individual countries are doing different things at that level?
I can say something, but I'm not an expert in anything of this. Just interested in what you're saying. I mean, thinking about the age that PISA uses for the tests, 15. That's a very difficult age, I think, because that's, I mean, if you wanted to test science, because many pupils are not interested in science anymore. They are at an earlier age, at least in Sweden, but they tend to lose their interest when they get at that age. And that may also, I guess, vary between different countries. So yeah, that's another issue, I guess.
If I may say something, first of all, I really want to thank for all the presenters, because I was really that was so interesting. Although I was so nervous about my own that could possibly not get everything right, but still, in regard to this question, I think that what seems to be the problem in relating between the problem that Sven has put forward between relating to the UNESCO focus on sustainable development and solidarity, international solidarity, and so on, and large-scale assessments in education, is that whether we agree on that not everything that is really important in education and also in science education is something that we can assess. And if we agree that there are some dimensions of this social practice that are crucial, like just experience of doing experiments and critically thinking together in the classroom, experience of being able to get the answer from the data that we are trying, that we are getting, and so on and so forth. If we think that there are some dimensions of this that are not just products that pop out at the end of the process and that we can grasp and measure, then I think we get to the point that we can see that there's not so much big problem in PISA as such, but in fetishization of PISA results by the policymakers that are simply reducing the quality of education as such to the rank that their system takes in the final results. And I think that is the problem. So PISA is a very sophisticated, incredibly well prepared assessment, but it doesn't tell you all you need to know about education, and it's not the end landmark of educational quality. So there is more to it, and you have to take more into account. That is how I see it.
So I think that is the purpose of our meeting, to express the vision of what could be contributed, what could be changed, and for the further development of PISA instruments. Because I believe that the work that has been done is tremendous, and I cannot even imagine a group of people who would develop such sophisticated instrument.
But we have to ask, why did we get PISA? Who wanted PISA? We already had the TIMSS project that was testing according to curricula. Who wanted it? For what purpose? What kind of assumptions about learning, children, the purpose of education, the philosophy, what kind of ideals, what values lay behind? Because they, and I agree, it's tremendous. It's probably the largest ever of these kind of studies. But who wanted it and why? And why couldn't we just continue with PISA, which with the TIMSS project, which actually does measure or try to measure according to the curricula? I think that's a pertinent question. It is a political instrument, and it's a political undertaking. And this is very clear from the very beginning, and they are quite explicit about it. They want to be normative, they want to give advice. And if you look at how Andreas Schleicher is going around in different countries, meeting the ministers of education, and not only of education, but also of industry, and telling them what to do based on the PISA data, how to run the education system and also the economy, actually. So these are questions we have to address as well, not just be impressed by the magnitude of the project.
It seems to me that one of the great difficulties of PISA, which we encounter even in science education, and I'm sure that in language, in item in the first of the three subjects, it's even worse, is that it conceives, and when you have put it very clearly in front of us, it conceives global education. And this is a front collision with education as being the sign in culture of the diversity of human beings, which is probably one of the most positive aspects of being on this planet, is being diverse, different, and being able to talk together. One could dream of PISA, which would measure how embedded in a given culture the test can be compared to another culture, and see if the children feel the difference and relation between the culture. But the idea of a globalized culture is a kind of oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms, in a sense. And I find that extremely worrisome, even for science, which is universal by principle. So being universal doesn't mean being identical in learning process, in roots in the local culture, etc. And I'm interested to see that in UNESCO, the accent is put on indigenous knowledge for climate, for instance. And this works, actually. It makes people more related to the challenge of education on climate science if one connects with the local culture. Did I say something wrong or scandalous? I listened to the silence.
After such a philosophical comment, it is difficult to continue with less philosophical questions.
I think Bueno, you've been trying to come in there for a few minutes.
Yes.
Yes. I just would like to thank Piotr, his important comments on the measurability and the importance of the things what we can measure. We who deal with education assessment, we know very well the limits of measurability and the things what we can measure. So we have a lot of saying and quotations related to that. I tried to cite what Albert Einstein said about it. So he said something like this, that not everything that is measurable is important, and not everything that is measurable is important. So we need to know that it's sometimes the most important things are not measurable. But on the other hand, we also quite often cite Galileo Galilei, who said that measure what is measurable and make measurable what is not so. So that's the essence of research, of educational research, but also think of medical research. How important it is that we can measure blood pressure, or we can measure the blood sugar level, or how important is today using reliable COVID-19 tests. Even these tests are not so reliable, or in the past couple of months, we learned a lot about the importance of medical research, but also the limitations of such a research process, even if the entire mankind and the researchers all over the world has been focusing on a single issue, how limited the capacity of research is. So I think that education and educational research is quite similar. You may not expect miracles from just such a single project. And as I tried to introduce, there are several levels of feedbacks. So PISA is just one level, and it's not for all purpose. We need national education systems when we measure what we consider nationally or locally important. And there are varieties of other assessments what we have to implement at classroom levels. So every teacher may measure and evaluate and assess something different. So don't expect everything from PISA. Of course, we can improve it. And I think that we also may discuss how can we improve the PISA process in general, because the decisions within PISA is made by governing board, and each country send a representative into the governing board. So you can try to influence your own representatives there. That's the parliament of PISA. On the other hand, it's also important to improve the interpretation. I also would like to comment David's presentation related to the validity. So what experts, PISA experts can do is to fix and improve the internal validity of the tests. But as for the interpretation, we cannot influence it centrally, but we can do it locally. So when in every 3 years, when in December the PISA results are published, each participating country or the policymakers or the media makes a different interpretation. And that's what I also mentioned, that there are silent scientists who are experts, but they are not willing to fight for the proper interpretation or improve the interpretation locally. So I think that we have to be aware that such a process is fragile. The possibilities of any scientific enterprise is limited, but we have to make out everything of it what we can. Thank you.
If I could respond to that, so I would fully agree, and I'm sure how to put that. I would say that the very foundations of the civilization that we call Western are simply built on subsequent attempts to measure things and to kind of develop our understanding of how the world and the reality works in that terms. Yeah, it goes without saying, but still, I think that that we should acknowledge that in education there are also some things that are decisive for educational quality that are not measurable, and I know that people who are in the measurement business are aware of that. But the problem is that the PISA as a political agent gives yet another impression. It's a completely different impression that we can measure the quality of education and that we do it. And if you ask me about how to develop PISA as a project, I would say that that would entail something almost impossible. That would entail to make it less important than it is right now. If we could achieve that our policymakers would concern that as less important than they are really doing now, that would be our achievement. So I have just few lines here. That's the beginning of a paper published recently. And these lines, I think they are very important. When the Norwegian Minister of Education, I cannot pronounce this name properly, apologize, Torbjørn Røe Isaksen, woke up early in the morning on December 6, 2016, he knew that it was a special day. In fact, and that's a quote, one of the most important days in my time as a minister, the PISA day. It had been written down in my calendar for at least a year. So that's how policymakers treat PISA. That's the day they have in calendars for over a year, and that's the most important day they are waiting for, because this is the day that they can show to the public that, look, here we are, that's our job, we did it, we, the policymaker, made it happen. That's the importance of this, because it shows very clear ranks, so you can show people that we are doing good job. And of course, nobody reads the 3 volumes. Everyone is focused on the one table that is published. That is obvious. That is the time of the Twitter democracy. I'm sorry to bring that up again, but still, it is the kind of the time we live in. So I think that if you want to make it really if you want to really develop PISA, make it less significant for policymakers.
I think the numbers have sort of rankings have replaced arguments about the purpose of schooling. What do we have schools for? Are our children happy? Do they leave school feeling empowered to meet life? Are they positive towards, did they like school? And so the whole purpose of schooling is replaced by rankings and numbers. And when these numbers come from outside, it's getting even worse. And I think that the authority of the OECD, the power of the OECD also makes it, since it comes from this organization, which really is giving advice on economic development of the country. When the advice comes from the OECD and the numbers come from the OECD, it has such a great authority that replaces debates about what we want with our education system, what what happens to our children? That's one of the worst thing, I think, implications of PISA and other measurements, when you think that you can measure everything and just put a number on it.
I have one question. One of the things that I was thinking as I listened to this conversation is, and you guys can answer this to me, does your group have a position paper on the correct interpretations, especially in science, for using international assessments? That's my first question. And then because I think that would be a powerful paper saying, you know, as leaders in science in your respective member countries, this is when the results come out, these are ways we think it could be appropriate and interpreted, in ways that we would caution. And then I guess to Benno, because he has so much expertise, what can the group do besides going to your board members in your country? Sometimes they're hard to talk to, but what can the group do then to influence a better kind of connection or have a voice heard within the PISA consortium, given that you have so much experience on the board?
Well, David, that is one thing that I suppose as a group we have been working on. And this was one of the purposes of this conversation, is to give us a more in-depth view into the different perspectives on what PISA is, on what it's assessing, on, you know, the challenges, the merits of PISA. And this was, I suppose, to give us a better insight and consideration of all different perspectives on PISA. And that as a result of this, we would like to meet again, hopefully, you know, in the next 2 weeks, to discuss a position paper, and with the possibility of putting out a position paper on this issue. So is there any other comments? I think this is what we're hoping from this, is to have a discussion to inform what kind of position paper we are. We have a draft position paper on PISA, and that we would like to discuss it further as a working group, following on from this discussion. Is that correct, members of the working group? Is that a good interpretation? Yes, thank you, Lena. Somebody's out there. Thank you.
May I ask a question to David and Leslie, who have worked so extensively inside both the IAA system with the TIMSS and PEARLS and so on, and now also with PISA. And at the same time, you are very critical in many of your writings. You are just on spot and being very critical. How do you manage to combine that? Is that okay, or is it? Are you a troublesome maker for them, or are you legitimizing the projects for them? Can you comment on the role that you have in this big enterprise, or several of them actually? Can you say something about that?
I think that I'm such a small dog barking around the ankles of the OECD that it doesn't really bother them too much. And I mean, it was only after that David and I had written our most critical pieces that I was invited to be on the technical expert group, and that I was appointed as chair. Now, I don't know if that was part of the OECD's effort to co-opt me or a recognition that they're happy with the criticism. But yeah, I mean, David and I feel like have always been faithful in this perspective that we're critics of these big tests and the organizations that run them. And I mean, in defense of the IEA, I would say especially, they and David has personally lived this, that they have been very receptive to criticism, and they take it in stride and they respond to it. And the OECD too has, to a certain extent, a paper that we wrote in 2016. One of the things that we complained about is that the technical report doesn't come out until a year after the results and the data are available. And in response to that, now they put out what's available. I mean, not everything is finished by the time the data come out, but they've been responsive, and they try to get the technical report out a bit faster. Yeah, David, maybe you want to add something?
Just a real quick story. Svein was nice enough to take us hiking when we lived in Norway, and we hiked one of the really famous Spessigans. It was absolutely horrible weather, and Svein is, I'm an ultra runner. Svein is a better hiker than both of us. Flew up the mountain. Leslie and I were beat, went to sleep, woke up in the morning. Someone's knocking at the door at 6 a.m. in the morning. It's Svein, and this was the question he asked us. So I've heard this question from you before, Svein. And
not in public.
Yeah. So I was 6 o'clock in the morning, drowsy, and we drank beer after the thing. So I'm a little more clear today. Yeah, I think it's a cross between. I think, like maybe some other people in the room, I think there's great promise in international assessment. I think it just has to be used correctly, and that's my feeling on it. So I think being part of the critical voice of saying that you need to use things correctly is important. Maybe I'm not on the side that they're all bad. I think they've done a lot for education, especially in looking at disadvantaged populations, and how much off some countries are. Right? It's really sad when we look at the results from the Dominican Republic, that we all live in a society that allows that to happen. I think those are some really important conversations. Now, is Norway that different from Sweden? Probably not, right? In fighting over 5 or 10 points, I don't think that's where the big issues are. But you know, if we see in some countries where immigrant students are doing worse, or students of color, I think that's really important information, and this is a really good way to show it. So I'm somewhere in between. The test can be overused, and I guess that's where my criticism would be. So that's how I sleep at night, at least.
If you had a voice in such a statement from this group, what would your main point be in that statement, all of the experts?
Perhaps Benno could start, because I think he had a response to something that I'm sure he has a response for your question too, given his expertise.
Well, I just would like to reflect to the to what Piotr said about the Norwegian Minister of Education. So let me mention that we do not have any Minister of Education for more than 10 years. I wish we had. And I would be happy with a minister like that one who knows at all but what PISA is. Even a minister would read only 1 page of PISA report. I would be very happy with that. So you are talking about the Swedish and Norwegian situation, but you forget that they are not typical countries, even not typical within the OECD countries, as there is a great variety how PISA reports are received and reflected in different countries. So there are countries, and not only Hungary, where it's not publicly discussed, or the ministers or the high-ranking ministry officers don't take care at all. So when I resigned from the PISA governing board in 2014, they sent a ministry officer there who is not doing there anything. I know from my friends who are still in the governing board that many of the governing board representatives just don't do anything there. And so please consider a broader range of the impact, local impacts of PISA before you do anything from your own perspective.
Can I comment on that? Because the OECD has itself made a comprehensive report on the impact of PISA worldwide. And I think that's a slide I've shown to some of you before. But it shows that it has a profound influence on educational policy in 65 countries, and they are listed actually, they're actually ranked according to the influence by the PISA project. And they state there that it has become a kind of global gold standard. That's in the abstract of the article. And it has led to new curricula, which are very much more in line with the OECD's emphasis on competency-based curricula. And also it has led to national testing, not only in the Nordic countries, because it has led to national testing being introduced in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, not yet in Finland, but in a lot of other countries, they have had profound influence on educational policy. And that's documented in not only by the OECD itself, but also by external reviewers. So I think it has a profound influence on education policy worldwide. Did I say something wrong, Jan? Jan, about Finland?
No, you're quite right. We are not using the PISA to make policy changes, but we actually use it as one of the tools to develop the curricula. And we don't believe in one particular number. We are interested about trends and about the diversity within the country, how to manage the education in general. And our governments have always had the idea that this kind of testing is used for development. And actually, we don't have these broad tests within the country in particular levels. So we are still sticking with just one matriculation exam after high school. So that's the only thing. We do have some testing done for development purposes, but they are not used for ranking or developing the local money distribution on anything. So we are different from the other Scandinavian countries in this sense. And also the development of, for example, curriculum it's totally democratic in the sense that anyone can have their say on the development.
May I also reflect on the importance of teams and PISA? So when PISA was conceived in the late 1990s, the purpose was to fix or improve some of the shortcomings of teams. There are a number of improvements, including the course-based sampling and many others. Also, the framework was improved and so on. But today, it is important for countries like Hungary that we have two different indicators or two independent assessment systems. My first training was that I graduated from the university as a teacher of chemistry and physics. And I learned both from chemistry and physics that before we do anything, we have to measure twice. So it's very important that we have two different set of data from about the Hungarian education system. And it's also very good that they are based on somewhat different philosophies. For example, we can understand why Hungarian students are better at TIMSS, which is curriculum-based, but they are not able to apply in practical context what they learned at school. So it helps us to understand something that is very important. Also, we understood why Hungarian students are better at grade 8 at PISA than at TIMSS than in the PISA assessments. Just think of failing half of the students at grade 7, not forcing them to repeat grade 7, not letting them to go to grade 8. The result will be that the results at grade 8, assessed at grade 8, will be improved because some of the poor students will not participate in grade 8 assessment. So that's something, a shortcoming of TIMSS. But if we have two independent data sets and compare them and do analysis deep enough, we may understand such things in education. Also, I have already mentioned some values that the PISA assessments try to promote, like equity and equality, and developing indicators for measuring that. Of course, they are not perfect, but the concept of resilience had a great impact in a number of countries on education.
Microphone.
I'm Pia from Sweden. It feels I should say something about Sweden compared to Norway and Finland. Piotr, you talked about the Norwegian minister who had marked in his calendar, and I feel that even more than the policymakers, it's the journalists that have the date marked in their calendar, because in Sweden, we hear for days and maybe weeks before the results come in that we are close to getting the results, and what will the trend be this year, up or down? And mostly we are hoping for up, of course, because we're comparing ourselves with Finland for some reason. And let's see what my point. The thing is that, of course, the policymakers, they have made changes in the past, but when the trend goes down, it seems that it's not because of the policies, obviously. If they go up, it's because of the policies. If they go down, it's because of the testing. And the general story has been within the media that the problem is within the tests, because as you said, they're not testing what we are teaching. And in Sweden, we have the general idea. I can say it's only in the media, but it could be in the public, that we are a little bit better, at least better than Finland, really, and Norway. And so if our results are going down, it has to be a problem within the tests. And of course, as we know, the tests are very good, and they are actually testing pretty much what we are teaching. So that is not the problem. So then the other story is, if the problem is not the tests, it must be within the students. So then the story is that in Sweden, because when the 15-year-olds take the tests, they are not graded. I don't think they even get to know their results. And if they don't get grades, they don't care so much about how well they do. So then the story in the media is that probably in other countries, maybe not Finland, but Singapore, China, the children always care about the results of the tests. So they produce better results. So that's pretty much our story. And it's a little sad that a test that we think really should show better results, at least in Sweden, doesn't. So also I want to know, it seems to me that when we have been discussing, we are fairly agreed on the tests being good. So what we want to do maybe is, how do we get the media to present it from another angle the next time? At least in Sweden, we are getting very bored with this angle of the tests being wrong or the students being wrong.
I just wanted to say really briefly, by contrast, in the United States, when the TIMSS results came out in December, now we have to condition this on the situation that was happening in the United States in December of 2020, which was an attempt to overthrow democracy. However, setting that aside, there were exactly 0 articles in the public media about the TIMSS results. There was nothing about it, no statement from the Department of Education, not the New York Times or the Washington Post. No one reported on it at all. And in the last cycle of PISA that was released in December of 2019, there was almost no coverage about it. So I think that there is this kind of sense of like becoming numb and disinterested about the way that the media is talking about this. Okay, the US is in the middle again. We're not doing very well. We don't really need to hear this story again.
I think it would be interesting to see the picture that, or the figure that you were talking about, Svein, with how the PISA results have influenced educational policy, because that's really important. And maybe, as you say, it's very different in different countries. So I mean, listening to all of you, I think it is apparent that there is a lot of good data in the PISA material that can be used for different kinds of research, but that it would be really important to point out, like Svein said, that what are the values that are really behind these surveys, and also what is really what can we use in these surveys and the statistics that we get, and be careful not to use it for too much for the educational policy. They are one piece of information that could be useful for some purposes, but not to really govern the politics of a country. So I think that would, if I would say something, that would be something that I would like to point out, that it's a good source of statistics and results to look at, but it's not anything that politicians should use uncritically to alter the educational policy. And that is an important statement.
Yeah, again, the Norwegian example, I think, is just one out of many, but the reforms that we got in nearly 20 years ago was legitimized by Norway not being on the top, which is always a surprise for us because we are used to be on top, or at least better than Sweden on many indicators. But this time we were in the middle, and it was created a kind of scandal by this, and something needs to be done. And that was by a conservative government, and they really want to use this to show that Norwegian education was bad. And they introduced a new reform called the knowledge promotion, and that was introduced in 2006. Now we've had this going on for nearly 20 years, this reform, and the latest PISA results show that we are on exactly the same. So the reform was legitimized by referring to PISA results. Now we have exactly the same results, and now it's celebrated by the same government or the same party as a great success for their reform. And they from the PISA report, you can take out arguments. You can make arguments for practically everything, depending on what kind of position you have. That there is a crisis and you need a reform, or that it justifies what we have just been doing. So you can find numbers that support either position. And for Sweden and Norway, we had the largest numbers of excluded students. That's, and I think David has been one of the co-authors of a recent article looking into this. The percentage being excluded, which we call fritak, to be liberated from, or they are free from, instead of being excluded, which is negative. So we are free, we don't take part. And of course, these nearly 10% in Sweden were at those who were most in danger or the lowest scoring, probably. So I don't know, would you comment on the articles that you have been co-publishing, David, on this?
Just simply that that some countries have much higher exclusion rates than other countries, and that those exclusion rates seem to influence scores. What we did in Norway, which I thought was pretty interesting, if you mask their exclusion rate from 2000 to 2018 or 15, and we did in 15, and then you just cut off the bottom students, what are most likely, especially in our research, most likely the bottom performing students are the ones you exclude. You can explain all of their score or all of their score climb in the country. So it just, countries, I don't think it was intentional, by the way. Especially our research showed it wasn't really intentional. It was just that, principals didn't feel like they wanted to give, if the kids didn't want to take those tests and they were poor performers, they said, okay, fine, you don't have to take it. So again, this goes into, I think every country is different, and every country tries and uses the data kind of differently. And we have to take all of that into account when we make our interpretations of the test.
If I may refer to few of the comments that were recently appeared in our discussion. So Poland is, of course, not a Scandinavian country, but it's PISA has a usually huge media coverage, and it's people in the governments are very attentive to these reports. or should I say to the league table that one of these reports contains. And so it's like, it's really important here, and it's really shaping education in the country. And I agree with Benno that that's purely a local perspective. I have no idea how this plays out around the world, and I thank Svein for turning my attention to the OECD report on the matter. So having said that, I would say that, referring to the question that Petra has posed, I would say that that it might be reasonable to go back to the question of the goals of education, of science education, and to the place of the results of large-scale assessments in education in relation to the goals of education, because I think that there is a kind of a swap over here, or a mispresentation that PISA could be as a program could be regarded as a resource for thinking about what is the goal of all of the things teachers are doing. So I think that there is a difference between being enchanted by the world, being fascinated by science, by nature, by all the processes that are taking place in the surroundings, and with having a portion of knowledge and a particular skills that can be tested. There is a difference in that. So if we aim to get young people fascinated by some processes or some phenomena that's in the world that surrounds us, then we are doing different things than when we are aiming just to prepare them, to train them to pass a test and have a high score as a result of that. And what is really going on in my country, and that is public knowledge, we discussed that in public, is that we choose the second path, and no one cares anymore in getting pupils into chemistry, physics, biology. They are being trained to pass the tests, and these tests are made in a fashion that PISA is establishing the gold standard for. And that is how it plays out over here. That's a local thing, but this is how it goes.
Well, Piotr, let me say something about Poland. Of course, an intellectual always has to be critical, and I appreciate your critical thinking about your country, but Poland could be a role model for the rest of Europe. Let me mention that there are a number of indicators where Poland is so prominent. For example, there were two indicators concerning education in the goals for 2020, in the set of European goals. One was the reducing the early school leavers, and Poland, the proportion of early school leavers in Poland is now about 5%, while in Hungary is about 12%. The European goal was 10. So Poland was a very good achiever at this. The other goal was increasing the high school or university graduates to 40%. That was the average, European average. But Poland set a goal of 45%, and Poland achieved this goal some years ago, while this goal in Hungary, unfortunately, was set to 33%, and we are just about at that level. And I can praise your educational development for hours. So I understand your critical attitude. Probably such achievements and improvement in Poland is due to such critical personalities like you. But on the other hand, I say that we would be happy with your problems. Thank you.
Simultaneously, we have a record in suicides in my God, how to put that in English? In the group of children that are school children. So we face a record after a record, year after year.
Yeah, but yeah, the champions used to be Hungarians and Finns, so don't worry
yes, of
about
course.
it.
But it's a trend that is increasing, and if you look at the data from the third volume of PISA, then you would see that the way that Polish students talk about their school is rather not optimistic. So they are also these indicators are also really like top rank. That is they encounter school violence every day. They don't feel supported by their teachers. The teachers seem not engaged in the work, and so on and so forth. So there is like, if you really look into the PISA report, there are this image is really blurred. It's not so optimistic, and it's not only dark. I agree with that, but from the perspective of also a person that comes from Gdańsk, which is a university that is engaged mostly in qualitative research of education in Poland. I can say that what comes out of the qualitative research is that more and more students and teachers feel that the practice of education is heading towards training, towards being trained, being kind of how to put that, maneuvered into something that is not human anymore. So they are very good and in so to say, in bringing the indicators up to the level that is needed, but there is I don't think that they are very happy with it in just being at school. And I think that there is a problem here that you cannot solve by large-scale assessments.
May I finally share a screen with you? I just put together here some paradoxes that we didn't talk about here. But if you're looking at results and what correlates with what, here is a list. No effect on the PISA score, public spending on schools, teacher salaries, class size, time spent on science, for instance, professional development, school leadership. And when it comes to PISA score, strong negative correlation with use of ICT in schools, and strong negative correlation with inquiry-based science education, which we really believe in. So we should at least look at these very strange paradoxes if you want to learn from PISA. You have to look at all data, not just being selective, and look at the ranking. This is very problematic. Thank you.
Let me also add that such paradoxes are the most stimulating challenges for researchers to understand and explain.
Yes, that is a problem explaining that, yes.
Let me just mention the physics at the very beginning of the 20th century. How many paradoxes have we seen just coming to your field? Well, some of them are intensively researched, some of these paradoxes.
I'm really sorry. I have another meeting 10 minutes ago.
Mm-hmm. We should finish.
Yeah.
I think we have come to some concluding point. All of us expressed our vision on PISA and PISA results. So now we should probably digest everything that was mentioned here today and have another meeting to summarize it into a statement. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a good plan. If I may, can I just say thank you? I suppose, first of all, I want to say thank you to Max. You've put a lot of work into the preparation of this. So can I just thank you for that and for your very good sharing of it. So thank you, Max. And can I also just thank, and I'm going to say it on the way where they come on my screen. So just to thank Leslie, Bueno, Sven, David and Peter. Can I pronounce your name? Piotr, for really interesting presentations. And I know it's very hard to gauge the interest when everybody is muted and, you know, there's no clap or, you know, after you speak, but it has really been informative. And it's late in the evening and we're still also engaged like 2.5 hours later. That just shows what an interesting topic is. So thank you. And for me, it's been the most interesting part of my day, and I'm nearly finished with my day. But and I'm really looking forward to, I mean, hopefully seeing everybody in Kiev. You know, certainly David, Leslie, and Piotr in Kiev, where we can discuss it further. So thank you, and big clap to everyone. And just before I let Maxime do the total close, just to say that we will be meeting to discuss this further. And so far, everybody has until tomorrow to fill that doodle poll, but it's looking like it's going to be Thursday, the 11th of February at 4 p.m. Central European time, 3 p.m. Dublin time. But I will wait till everybody responds, and I'll confirm that tomorrow with the Zoom link for that meeting. So I'm going to hand you over now to Maxime to do the concluding words.
Well, thank you very much, and thank every participant. You made an enormous contribution to general discussion and presentation. And I will try to be as fast as possible to share the recording between the group and all the information that goes with it. And I'm looking forward to next discussion of the statement, and definitely I'm looking forward to meeting everyone in Kyiv to have even more productive discussion. So I assume the meeting is closed.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Okay.